welcome everyone. We're going to do a little bit of an intro before the presentation. So get yourself settled, get yourself a drink, get comfy, get ready for some excellent content. So welcome to the first webinar for our sexual violence prevention webinar series. We've been planning this for a few months and we're super excited to have some really great presenters with this series. And we're super excited for Barb's presentation in just a few moments. So welcome. So just some Zoom keeping for today. We are in webinar, so everyone is muted and your videos are off automatically. So if you do have any questions, there's a couple ways that y'all can do that. So we have two images here. There's one image where you can raise your hand. So if you do want to ask a question verbally, please hit that function down at the bottom, and then we will make sure that you are unmuted. Otherwise, if you prefer to use the Q&A function for your questions, please use that. We ask that you use the Q&A function for your questions. That way it won't get lost in the chat, and we're more easily able to catch those questions instead of getting lost in the chat. So for the chat function, if you see on the bottom, there's two options where you click where it says to. So if you want to talk to any of the WCASA staff or to talk to Barb, please make sure that it's all panelists. Otherwise, if you want like comments or discussions to go to everyone, make sure you click all panelists and participants. This session is recorded, so if you do wish to remain more anonymous, you can use the Q&A function for your questions. So we have a giveaway. We are able to give away a couple of books at the end of this series. So this is actually the topic for our next session. So we are going to be using the registration for folks who have attended the webinars. You're automatically going to be put into a giveaway. And once the sessions are done, we will announce those winners and we will get those books to you. So just a reminder, there's nothing that you need to do. You're automatically going to be entered into the giveaway.
And just to let you know that this is the first ever time that we've done this. So you are lucky to be attending.
Our virtual door prize.
So just a little bit of introductions for ourselves. This is the series team. The four of us have been working on this. And here's our contact information. You probably have all of this already, but just so you have it, Sarah, Megan, myself, Angie, and Peter. Always want to plug WCASA's resources. The prevention page, which has so much information about sexual violence prevention, is on the website. And then our YouTube page, which links to past webinars that we have done that are prevention focused, advocacy focused. It's all just a well-rounded resource if you'd like to look at past webinars that you might not have been able to attend. And then here is our calendar of events. So the next session is October 23rd, same time frame from 10 to noon. The registration has already gone out, so if you did not register yet, please contact Sarah, and her email is down at the bottom, and we can make sure that you are registered. Registrations for the next sessions have not gone out yet. We didn't want to send all of the registration on it at the same time because we wanted to make sure that people actually see it. So the next 4 sessions after the 23rd are listed there. So we have, let me move my control so I can read. The November 6th is talking about anti-racism for white people. On November 20th, we're getting Partners for Youth. Oh, Groundwork is a Madison-based organization that is, its sole function is for white folks to engage in anti-racism work. November 20th, Partners for Youth Empowerment is a national organization and they're going to be talking about online facilitation, so how to engage folks in this virtual environment that we have all been existing in for a few months now. Tanji Reese is going to talk about engaging youth, and also like how do we engage youth when we're not really going to be able to engage with them in person, potentially. And then Nubia Pina is going to be talking about just social justice as a prevention kind of framework in general. So we're really super excited. Again, registration for the upcoming webinars are going to go out in batches. So the registration for the next 2 webinars will be going out super soon. And then we'll be sending out, Peter will be sending out registration for the following 2 webinars after that. So be on the lookout for that. Any questions about anything else or any comments from staff before we head into the presentation from Barb today?
Nothing to add besides thanks everyone for being here. I see a lot of familiar names and I'm really excited to have Barb presenting today.
I'll echo that. Thank you everybody for being here. As Angie mentioned, I'm Sarah, the other prevention coordinator with WCASA. And if you have questions about the rest of the series, my email is available down at the bottom of that flyer.
And I might as well chime in too. I'm Peter, Events and Technology Coordinator. Hello. If you have tech questions, type them in the chat and we'll help you out.
All right, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then Barbara, you are good to go.
Okay. Where'd you go? I lost my controls. There we go. All right. So good morning, everybody. My name is Barb Blackdeer-Mackenzie, and I am here to talk about responding for community resiliency, comparing adverse childhood experiences and historical trauma. So how did I get into this work? Well, so you can see my family. There's my parents, and it was right at the Loving decision when they got married in 1966. So as a mixed race couple, while it was legal in Wisconsin, it was still socially challenged quite a bit. So they kind of put our families together like Brady Bunch. And so that's, you know, a lot of the mix here. Over here is my dad. And this is probably the extent to which I saw people of color up until probably college. So in that sense, you know, other than Ho-Chunk people or Native Americans, I really didn't see Black people or Latino that I know of. You know, I'm sure that there were Latinx that identify as Native American, but that wasn't the case for me. So in that sense, with my life, here we go. How I got here. I grew up with PTSD in my household. My dad was a World War II veteran, and he was also a storyteller. Growing up, I didn't have much micro context with being Ho-Chunk since I lived apart from intensive tribal communities. I went to college. I loved learning. My dad always wanted me to work for my tribe, which was at the time Wisconsin Winnebago Business Committee. He passed in 1988, and my mom finished her book called Eagle Blessed Our Home in 1990. The Ho-Chunk Nation was renamed in 1996 to reflect that, so it's no longer the WWBC. I started working there right at the constitutional transition, and I worked in enterprises as a trainer, then chief administrative officer. I was fast-tracked to the office of the president, since so few of us at that time had college degrees. So it was rather daunting to be handed the keys and told, well, you need to earn $250 million a year for us. And here I had a major in the humanities where I avoided math. So it was really scary. I moved into the office of the president and worked for 8 different presidents in different executive capacities. So my learning curve was constantly 90 degrees. Politics being what it is, I moved along to work at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I taught there, and while I had my bachelor's, it was kind of odd to teach at that point. I did get my master's degree while teaching. I came back to work for the tribe. There's more politics. I went into my doctoral program, and wham, intersectionality of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma happened. Nancy Oestreich-Lurie's book on Wisconsin Indians, and then my mother's book with my dad's stories documented, and then my own personal experiences all intersected. And it basically got identified when I got some help as historical trauma. Nancy had mentioned things like poor conditions, unsanitary, those types of things for children to attend the boarding schools. And then my mom's book talked about my dad going to his sister's bedside at Toma Indian School, and he was only 5 years old, but she was on her deathbed at the hospital there, and she was dying of TB. And I had, no concept of this, and neither did he at 5 years old. So all of a sudden, those two pieces intersected, and my experience with the tribe, there was some wicked historical trauma, lateral oppression type things going on that I would get occasionally. People would say, why aren't you following this more, or why is it that you aren't respectful in doing this? And there were definite almost bullying type things that happened. Well, when I finally got it together and asked the question, well, who was supposed to teach me this stuff? Then people answered my question. They said, well, your aunts or your chewies. And all of my chewies were gone by the time I was 2 years old. So in that sense, who was I supposed to learn from? And sure, there are a lot more of my aunties around, but near me, that wasn't the case. So in that sense, it was a real punch in terms of what happened with the intersectionality and actually getting the diagnosis of historical trauma. So I went on my own search because behavioral health did not have, no matter where I went, I went to several different health systems, and the therapist didn't seem prepared for what I had to say. And so I started learning myself in order to heal myself. I took lots of different trainings, including Mending Broken Hearts from White Bison, Mothers of Tradition, also from White Bison, Positive Indian Parenting, which is from ICWA, Survivors of Homicide, Suicide and Genocide, Medicine Wheel by Charity Thunder, Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, which is the operationalization of Peggy McIntosh's work with unpacking the white privilege knapsack, 7 Challenges, which was having to do with addiction, motivational interviewing, and traumatic brain injury by the International Forensic Nurses Association. Add that to now 9 years of post-high school experiences, and I started to understand some things that other people didn't. So I wrote Ho-Chunk Resilience as a primer and a shorthand history of the Ho-Chunk people to better understand the periods of historical and intergenerational trauma. These things weren't taught in schools, and yet they could be, with some care. And the care had to do with just like you would learn something about the Nazi Holocaust. So I've dedicated part of my life to working to change social studies curriculum to make it possible so that people better understand how to relate to one another. Then I met Leah Denny, and I will talk about her throughout this presentation. She is currently the CEO and founder of HIR Wellness Institute. Now, HIR stands for Healing Intergenerational Roots Wellness Institute. Our mission is to establish a social justice informed and culturally rooted intergenerational healing approach that improves mental health and wellness outcomes for Indigenous and underserved communities. Our vision is to create the future leaders and healers for the next generation with respect to the relationship with one another and our ancestors. HIR Wellness Institute follows the ancestral teachings and Indigenous knowledge of the Children's Fire. The 2 laws of the Children's Fire is that the Children's Fire must forever keep going and the feminine must be protected. We will always seek to protect our future by pledging that no harm will come to our children by doing what is in their best interest and nurture the continuation of our ways. Our programming fosters a community-informed practice that addresses the complex impact of historical and intergenerational trauma through applying an intergenerational healing-informed approach. So the goal of our organization essentially is to provide high-quality, trusted services and programming to our relatives. I like to say, and I think that you can agree, since you're in human services fields as well, that I want to inspire people. And I've actually had this happen where a person has said this to me. I want someone to look at me and say, because of you, I didn't give up. And that to me makes all of the tough stuff that we go through in human services worthwhile. For me, the human services field is about connection, and the better and stronger and faster I can make that connection, the more effective I feel and think as a practitioner. Oops. Our agenda today is the introduction, which we just finished, adverse childhood experiences, historical intergenerational trauma and transmission, a comparison of the two, and then we'll talk about community resiliency, community activated medicine, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
Hey,
So
Barbara, one quick thing. Could you see if you can hide the control panel? It should be under either more or if there's a view options. There we go. Let's see. Hide floating meeting controls.
hide names of annotations?
Two down. There you go.
Okay. So I would like you to use the chat box to answer the following so we can get some feedback going. What are adverse childhood experiences? So the chat will be reviewed by our moderators from WCASA, and they'll tell me some general ideas of what's going on. What are ACEs? We getting any answers?
They're starting to come in.
I'm muted. Experiences that create barriers to growth and the connection with the healthy parts of environment and relationships. Poverty. Any experience in a childhood that can create trauma.
Good.
Children in DV situations. Child abuse is an example. Experiences that impact future health outcomes. Witnessing domestic abuse. Events in childhood which have, oh, we're going fast now. Negative events in childhood that have a negative impact on development. The next one is very similar, but says wellness instead of development, which I think is an important note to add. Traumatic experiences, experiences that affect a child's growth, development, behaviors, impacts into adult life, such as parental death, incarceration, abuse.
Okay. That sounds great. So we've got some people who have some background in this. So the official definition from the CDC includes adverse childhood experiences or potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood 0 to 17 years. So as you exemplified, experience violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home or community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide, and also included are aspects of the children's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as substance misuse, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation, or household members being in jail or prison. And while ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in adulthood, ACEs can also negatively impact education and job opportunities. However, ACEs can be prevented. So how many of you have actually, or do you know your ACEs score? And I decided to put the questions up here so that you'd have the chance to take a look at these. And of course, they're completely subjective. And you can put yes and no on a paper and then put marks beside them as you read the 10 questions. And it's interesting because I've been learning a lot about myself as I have started this new position, and things have come to light that I never had thought about or, didn't feel safe enough to bring forward. So my ACEs score actually changed. So I think it's important every once in a while to go through the questions and figure that out.
We're getting a few scores, some 9s, some 6, 7, a 2, wide range.
Wow. So what I find interesting about that is you wonder how you got to the point where you're at now. Now, Rise Center out of California did some great stuff in 2015 in terms of their research. So they created a pyramid, and the Adverse Childhood Experiences Pyramid, you can see the foundation here. The second level is social, emotional, and cognitive impairment that they talk about within the definition. The adoption of health risk behavior, disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. So all of these pieces come together to create a person's life. And of course, they're all based in the foundation of childhood. So you also see the whole life perspective is represented from conception to death on the left side, and the scientific gaps that take place between the various fields of social work, behavioral health, medical, and neuropsych. So all of those pieces create these scientific gaps that we don't know much about either. And I should say the gaps part, we know plenty about the actual fields. So in that sense, there's not a whole lot of answers just yet in terms of how to prevent everything that's going on from a childhood and make a person resilient. Now that brings up my next point, which is it's really important to discover your resilience score as well. And in this one, you can see on the right side, there's definitely true, probably true, not sure, probably not true, and definitely not true. So again, you just put a mark by each one according to your question responses. So I believe that my mother loved me when I was little, definitely true. So I put a mark there and I go on to the next question. So you give a couple minutes to do that. And the reason that resilience is so important in understanding trauma is that, you know, some people will take this downward spiral, perhaps even to, you know, they'll have that everything that was explained from ACEs, you know, to the disability, the impairment, and early deaths, all of those different types of things. But resilience allows us to counterbalance. And while the resilience questionnaire is not exactly a match to say, well, you know, if I can check off this, my ACEs score of 8 and make it 7, because I had this question on the resilience questionnaire, you do get a general sense of, okay, I do have some interesting resilience coping skills. So those are the questions that come up, which is how many of these 14 protective factors did I have as a child and youth? And how many, so that's how many were definitely true or probably true. And then of those circled, how many are still true for you? When I originally did this questionnaire, I was interested to find that I had kind of dismissed or put to the background at least 3 of them. And I said, wow, I really need to work on my relationships to feel a better support network. We getting some scores in?
There's an 8, 11, 14.
Sweet.
Growing up, I had 13, but now say 14,
Good.
12, 13. Lots of high scores.
Good. And I think that that speaks to the fact that you are functional within our society. Likely you've gotten your degree, you're in a professional setting doing professional work. That's not necessarily what we see in some of our clients, and it has a lot to do with our resilience. So one of the things when we're looking at the ACEs pyramid is to talk about epigenetic mechanisms as well as intergenerational transmission. Now, epigenetics, I think we can start, yes, with why inheritance is weirder than we thought.
The sweet smell of fruit doesn't normally send rats running, but when researchers paired the orange, cherry, almondy scent of the chemical acetophenone with a painful electric shock, lab rats quickly learned to fear it. Along the way, extra neurons sprouted in their noses and in the smell processing center of their brains, making them super sensitive to the scent. This result isn't shocking. What is surprising is that the rats' pups and their pups' pups were also startled by the smell of acetophenone and had the same extra neurons as their fathers, despite never having been introduced to either their dads or the fruity scent before. But how could the pups have inherited something that their fathers learned? Basic genetics tells us that only DNA gets passed along to offspring. Characteristics like memories, scars, or giant muscles can't get passed on since acquiring them doesn't alter the genetic code. But it turns out that instilling fear in the rats did trigger genetic changes, not in the DNA sequence itself, but instead in how that code was read and used in the rats' bodies. In every cell, biological machinery constantly translates DNA into the proteins needed to carry out vital processes. Chemical switches attached to the DNA turn genes on or off or up and down, telling the machinery which proteins to produce and in what quantities. These switches, called epigenetic tags, are why a kidney cell looks and acts differently than a skin or nerve cell, even though all three cells have identical DNA. But the switches in any one cell aren't set in stone. Teaching those rats to fear the fruity smell switched one of their smell sensing genes into overdrive. Researchers don't know all the places in the rats' bodies where this switch got flipped, but they know it happened in one key set of cells, the rats' sperm cells, which would one day pass along the tweaked genetic material, making the next generation of rats super sensitive to acetophenone. Rodents aren't the only creatures demonstrating this weird type of inheritance. In Ivakalik, Sweden, boys who suffered through tough winter famines went on to have super healthy sons, with extremely low rates of heart disease and diabetes. And their sons had the same excellent health, living an unbelievable 32 years longer on average than the grandsons of boys who hadn't gone hungry. To be clear, this does not mean that we should start starving our kids for the benefit of future generations. Scientists don't even know yet exactly which switches the Swedish famines flipped. While we have been able to connect specific epigenetic changes to health effects in mice, we're a long way off from being able to make those connections in humans. That may sound like a bummer, but it's mostly because we humans don't live in the well-controlled environment of a laboratory. And for that, we should be grateful.
Do that. So raising awareness of ACEs can help and change how people think about the causes of ACEs and who could help prevent them. We can shift the focus from individual responsibility to community solutions. We can reduce the stigma around seeking help with parenting challenges or for substance misuse, depression, or suicidal thoughts. We can promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments where children live, learn, and play. So let's help all children reach their full potential and create neighborhoods, communities, and a world in which every child can thrive. So I want you to keep in mind with the video on the rats where they were talking about how that passed along and there was a red zone that they showed, because we'll talk about that in just a minute. So we have ACEs prevention strategies, and these are available through the CDC site. With that, there's strengthening economic supports. I think I heard that in the chat comments. Strengthen household financial security and family-friendly work policies. Promote social norms that protect against violence and adversity with public education campaigns, legislative approaches to reduce corporal punishment, bystander approaches, men and boys as allies in prevention. Ensure a strong start for children, early childhood home visitation to get people used to it, and high quality childcare. Preschool enrichment with family engagement is also useful. We can teach skills, social emotional learning, teach people the definitions, teach our children how to express themselves and say, you know, okay, my behavior, I feel, you know, fill in the blank. I feel sad, I feel mad. But those types of understanding are very interesting when we talk about the mental health profession, because there's so many people that don't know those words. And yet oftentimes, like within the medical field, we'll go in and say, oh, well, you know, I scratched my knee and it's pretty deep, so I probably need some hydrogen peroxide, maybe a prophylactic antibiotic and some bandages. Well, you know, so we can almost self-diagnose ourselves. When we go into mental health, that's not the case. So teaching the skills surrounding emotions is really becoming an important point that we need to reinforce. So moving on, connect youth to caring adults and activities, mentoring programs, after-school programs, and intervene to lessen the immediate and long-term harms, like enhanced primary care, victim-centered services, treatment to lessen the harm of ACEs, and treatment to prevent problem behavior and future involvement in violence, family-centered treatment for substance use disorders. So use the chat box to answer, what is historical and intergenerational trauma and transmission?
If trauma passed on from ancestors, suffering that is passed through different means, trauma passed through genes,
Good.
generational trauma, from generation to generation.
And it's interesting as you talk about the genes, because it's actually the epigenetics that are passing that along in terms of the trauma itself. And that was why I mentioned that red zone in the rat video, because that's where the neurobiology of a human is in survival mode. And so it literally writes into your survival code, into the limbic system, and eventually into the brainstem, and then again through the sperm and so on, to identify those particular places within the next generation where they will have certain survival skills. So to define historical trauma, we'll start with Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She says that historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. Some expressions of HTIGT include, but are not limited to, anomie, which is the lack of usual social or ethical standards, poor affect, death identity, idealizing the past, substance abuse, social mimicry, psychic numbing, emotional isolation, interrupted grief, incomplete or misdiagnosis in mental health, behavioral health, hypervigilance, and or disruption in attachments. Psychohistorian Howard Stein says the traumatic transmission ferries out unacknowledged grief along multiple vectors. Stein says mourning is quote unquote short-circuited and groups become stuck in time, and collective solidarity is created in the process by Fromm. I've kind of shortened the definition for myself, where it's the passing along of survival characteristics through genetics, epigenetics, and social transmission. So when Braveheart's talking about anomie as, you know, the social and ethical standards that don't fit social norms, there we're talking about responses to behavior in extreme situations. So society doesn't generally go through those types of extreme situations. With transgenerational transmission of trauma, it renders some children of survivors vulnerable to stress while others become more resilient. Both seem to remember what their parents and grandparents might have forgotten. Now, TTT was previously assumed to be caused primarily by environmental factors such as the parent's child-rearing behavior, but new research suggests that it may also be inherited through epigenetic mechanisms which become a kind of biological cell memory. This is also called blood memory. So we talked a little bit about the DNA sequences and what's involved with that. Bonus if you can actually write out what DNA is. And the epigenetics. And then my third part of my definition was social transmission. So here's my dad, my mom, and I'm in the middle. And the transmission is the giving of a task. The next generation must grapple with the trauma, find ways of representing it, and spare transmitting the experience of hell back to one's parents. A main task of transmission is to resist dissociating from the family heritage and, quote, bring its full tragic story into social discourse, unquote. So here's the money slide. This is what you came here today for. Rise Center, of course, did our ACEs pyramid, and we've covered that. It's very similar over here on the historical trauma and embodiment. But you'll see that, instead of ACEs, we have ACEs and potentially complex trauma, social, emotional, cognitive, allostatic load, disrupted neurological development, adoption of health risk behavior, coping, and that can be with positive, healthy coping skills or negative, unhealthy coping skills. Diseases, disability, and social problems, and the burden of disease, distress, criminalization, stigmatization, and then, of course, on both of them, the early deaths. So on the historical trauma and embodiment, we're also talking about microaggressions, implicit bias, and epigenetics. With microaggressions, that's also something known as death by 1,000 paper cuts. So like when I was in 3rd grade and kids would tease me and they would say things like, well, if you're an Indian, then where's your feathers? Or do you live in a teepee? And those types of things. Those are all, they're not serious aggressions that are going to get people in trouble in school, but they are microaggressions that start to build up in a person. And when you talk about the neurobiology of a person and you start to retain stuff like cortisol, yeah, it's going to make you fatter through time. So implicit bias is another piece where people think they know what's going on in the world, and it might seem that way, but it's always good to check. And then, of course, the epigenetics. And then with historical trauma and embodiment, we have 2 additional foundations, which include the social conditions and the local context and generational embodiment of historical trauma. So with the social conditions, especially when you have like the implicit bias, say we're talking about like inner cities and the preponderance of Black population within inner cities during the 50s and 60s. Well, part of the social conditions included redlining from banks. So Black people were barred from getting the housing loans that would allow them to live in the suburbs. They couldn't buy the convenient house that had been built for everybody else coming back from World War II. So that's one aspect. Another is the local context. What does it look like, feel like, sound like on a regular basis in terms of your life and how it fits in as race into that life? And I have to say that in conversation with white and non-Native people, one of the things, or I should say just non-Native people, has been to actually talk about the fact that we're constantly asking the question, is it because of my race? Did this happen because I'm Indian? Or did they not like me because I'm Native American? This happens for a lot of people of color. So I used the chat box to answer the following. What is community resiliency?
We have the ability to buffer adversity.
Good.
I think folks are still typing.
It's a longer definition, huh?
Coming together as a community to combat past or present traumas.
There we go.
The ability for a community to overcome an event that affected a population rather than just an individual.
Sure, absolutely.
And to have shared an adverse trauma, get through it together, a collective way to support all members of a community.
Good. All right, we'll take a hold there just so long as you have some ideas in your mind. So one of the things that we've applied at HIR Wellness is community-based participatory research. And there we're utilizing things like practice-based evidence in order to build evidence-based practice. And those of you that have to write grants know that times we are hamstrung with stuff that works, but can't provide the evidence necessarily or the research. So HIR Wellness in part is working to resolve that gap and create the research that allows us to better navigate some of these different communities in terms of funding sources and actual healing. So I told you I'd tell you about Leah Denny. Now she did this amazing thing, not only founding HIR Wellness, but she put together her master's thesis based on the generational adversity and trauma experience, which is the GATE study. And for her master's at Mount Mary's, she had the intent to quantify data that so many had diligently qualitatively described. And I thought about that and went, yeah, you know, there's plenty of quotes I can put in these, but not a whole lot of statistics. So she'd done her lit review, she put together the instrument, got it approved, got it past the IRBs. The questionnaire ended up 12 pages long. Now, I don't know a whole lot of people who are willing to sit there for 12 pages and answer questions that are, you know, for all intents, pretty depressing. But we managed to get 112 respondents, and that's how we met. I was one of those respondents. I asked what she was going to do with this, as did many other people. And while she was influenced by many of us, her options were open. She could have easily gone to get her doctorate by just expanding her pilot into a full study with more respondents, and we pretty much would have lost her to academia and never seen her again. However, there was a key person, an elder veteran, who asked to shake her hand and asked her to do something with this information. And it was that was the pinnacle of which she said, no, I'm not going to bother going to get my doctorate because there are things that I can do now to help our community. And so she created HIR Wellness. And, you know, for the longest time it worked out of her trunk of her car. But recently with the VOCA funding that we got last year, we've been able to put plenty in place. So I wanted to expand a little bit on the instrument, which was to include the historical loss scale. If you've never taken a look at that, it's by Whitbeck, Les Whitbeck, and it embraces the loss of culture, land, and people as a result of colonization. And with that, the empirical efforts to understand the consequence of historical loss are limited partially because of the lack of valid assessments. However, there are indicators that a standardized measure being developed was very necessary. And so she continues to work on refining that possibility. Now, one of the things that she found was that with the national study, the Kaiser research, people with ACE scores of 0 ended up to be 36% of the respondents. 1 ACEs, 26, 2 ACEs, 16, 10, and 13. With the Wisconsin study, it reflected pretty similarly where, you know, people had either 0 or 1 ACEs, and then some people had higher level ACE scores. But with First Nations, the ACEs scores in Wisconsin for our group, you know, we had a pretty steady flow of the 0, 1, and 2, a little bit of a downward trend on 3, But when we hit the 4 aces or more, we're talking almost 50%. And part of the sub-instrument also indicated that almost 75% of the people indicated that they had experienced racism at some point in their lives. So we've heard a lot about cultural competency, especially like in the school settings and different workplaces and human services. And it's a term used to dance around the need for organizations to provide explicitly anti-racist training. But Angela Davis, I think, hit the mark when she said, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So this next part is going to be to help frame mindsets for non-Native people here in this training. And so we'll start off with Brene Brown. She's always one of my favorites. She says, staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience connection. Now, one of my friends, Gail Cruz Roberson from Seed Training, had said, lean into the discomfort. These conversations are not comfortable, but you really need to challenge yourself as a non-Native to understanding how to work with Native populations. So even though this film, some of these clips are from 1994, I find them relevant, especially since Milwaukee has proclaimed racism as a public health crisis, as well as, our issues in Kenosha and Minneapolis and so on. It's been a hard year. So let's start off with David.
Title
American.
of American.
Well, I agree
And
with that. I don't think we do.
I refuse to be segregated or to be allocated to a lower status by not being recognized as an American.
I like that attitude, and I think that's a correct and proper attitude. Whereas
I'm also Chinese.
Yes.
I'm very proud of that. And for a person to look at me and say, for a white person to look at me and say, you're just like me, we're both American, totally insults me because it denies my identity as a Chinese person too.
You give us a hard time for being white and being American and being in control. I've never felt in control. I had vineyards and pear orchards for many years, and I employed many of your people, if you wish to call them that. They're my dear friends. To me, they are friends equal to any that I would have. And I greet them. And now they come into my business and they just want to come in and say hi and talk to me.
There's something different that's happened. What's different that's happened for us, and I'm speaking as a people, borders on genocide, takeover, colonization. You know what happens to me when I pass a mission? Yeah. Not the same thing that happens to every group that passes a mission. There's something different. When I hear Father Unipero Serra, what do you think I think of? It's not...
Conquistador.
It's chopping off hands, sure. It's slavery, that's what's different. And it gets tiring to not have that difference known. It gets tiring to not have that difference acknowledged and to have to keep talking about it. That's what gets tiring.
So I see here an attitude expressed by Utaka and by Roberto that says, how can I be an American? I can't, and so I won't. I'm going to cling to my heritage. Is this clinging the problem? Is this belief that you cannot become American the problem? For years I've said, why do these guys have such a problem being a color? Why can't they just be individuals and go out and make a place for themselves? And I hear you saying that we whites don't allow that we keep you down. Why aren't we just humans? I mean, why aren't we just brothers?
I love David. He's so brave. So I'll hear from Victor.
To your saying that, that I create my own racial predicament by my thinking and my attitudes?
You block your progress
I block my own progress.
by allowing your attitude toward the white man to limit you.
I think the police limit me. I think that white supremacy has placed limitations on where I can go and what I can do, but I don't think that I cause my own predicament under white supremacy. And by white supremacy, I don't mean neo-Nazis, and I don't mean Klan, because I'm terrified of those people on an interpersonal basis. Institutionally, not terribly much, because most of the lethal, toxic, deadly racism African-American people experience and that other people of color experience in this country does not come from them. It comes from moral, fair-minded, people who believe that they are lovers of justice, churchgoers, people who experience themselves as decent and actually very nice folk. And it is there that I find my fear. Back to the question of what it means to be white. I think what it means to be white, in part, is that you have the privilege of blaming people of color for their own victimization under white supremacy. I've heard you say that to me. I've heard you say that to him. I've heard you say that to him. I've heard you say it to him. I've heard you say it to every person of color in the room who challenged your perception of yourself in the world. That is part of what it means to be white.
Maybe that's part of the answer, that we feel that the field is wide open and each man can stand on his own.
No. Each man does not stand on his own. Some men stand on other men and other women. Light-skinned men, men from Europe stand on the heads and the hearts of men and women and children of color. That is, and of course, you also stand on the heads of white women. But no, it's not a question of every man standing on his own ground. All of the ground, damn near, of this planet has been taken from almost all of the people of color on this planet. You know, Australia was a black continent. Africa was a black continent. And if the people themselves were not taken from Africa, then everything of value was taken from Africa to the extent that that was possible. North America was a red continent. South America was a red continent. You are not standing on your own ground. You are standing on red ground. And that's what it means to be white. To say that you're standing on your own ground and standing on somebody else's. And then mystify the whole process so it seems like you're not doing that.
I have to say that the rage that Victor shows in this is something that I've felt myself, and talking with other people of color, it certainly has been an issue as well. So if you have never heard this kind of conversation, take a deep listen.
Sort of silent consciousness about what it means to be American that I sense coming from white folks that I'd like to talk about. Before I do that, I'd like to say one more thing that's hard about talking about racism, and that is that people of color are spilling their guts and doing education to white people. Let me explain to you how you've got this wrong. Let me explain to you how you've got that wrong. Let me explain, and then we get cross-examined, and it's like, well, maybe your problem is blah, 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 blah. And it's always, racism gets looked at as a person of color's problem, and it's not. We're like on the receiving end of the problem, but we are not the problem. I walk in a world where black people, where Latinos, where Asians, where Arabs, all these different people are experienced as problem people, and that, well, we're going to deal with the person. Racism is essentially a white problem, and that for you to understand what racism is about, you're going to be so uncomfortable. You're going to be so different from who you see yourself to be now that there's just no way for you to get it from where you're sitting. And I'm not saying that you could never get it. I mean that you need to step outside of your skin and step outside of what seems really comfortable and familiar to you and launch out into some real, for you, unknown territory. And you haven't gone out there like you haven't, gotten in proximity to black people, as you say, because you don't have to. And that's part of what it means to be American, to me, is to have all these things that you can do if you want to, that you don't have to do if you don't want to do. And there's a way in which American and white and human become synonyms. That why can't we just treat each other as human beings? To me, when I hear it from a white person, it means, why can't we all just pretend to be white people? I'll pretend you're a white person, and then you can pretend to be white. Why don't you eat what I eat? Why don't you drink what I drink? Why don't you think like I think? Why don't you feel like I feel? God damn it, I'm so sick and goddamn tired of hearing about that. I'm sick of that. That's what it means to be human being to me. That's what it means to be white. That's what it means to be American. Why don't you come the hell over here? That's what I hear every goddamn day. And you know that I can't come over there. You know that this skin and that this hair and that this way that I talk and that I think and I feel will never, ever get included because I'm unpalatable to this goddamn nation. I'm unpalatable. You cannot swallow me. You cannot taste me. You cannot feel me because you don't want to. You think that you can survive without me, but you can't, man. You think that, hey, it'll all be fine when we just treat each other like human beings. And what that says to me is, don't be yourself. Be like me. Keep me comfortable. Connect where I'm ready to connect. Come out to my place. Or maybe I'll come down and get some artifacts from your place. That is bullshit. When you say that your ethnicity is American, there is no American ethnicity. You had to throw away your ethnicity to become American. That's what it means. That's what it means. You give up who you are to become American. And you can pretend that it's okay because you're white. When we give up who we are to become American, we know that we're dying from it. You're dying from it too, but you don't know it necessarily. Get ethnic, you know? You know, I'm not going to trust you until you're as willing to be changed and affected by my experience and transformed by my experience as I am every day by yours. I attended a school for the first time that was predominantly white, and I had white teachers. And I walked into the classroom, and there were 3 reading groups in my 5th grade classroom, and I was promptly put into the lowest reading group. And I gathered very quickly that that was because I'm of African and American descent. Then they put me into the intermediate reading group, and then they put me into the highest reading group, and I just boiled and churned through the whole process because my reading level was higher than anything they had in the classroom. I'm always dealing with you. I'm always dealing with you. You don't deal with him. You don't deal with me. Maybe you had an opportunity to deal with some Latino people. Well, we always deal with you, baby. Always. Every day.
So as he was speaking about always dealing with you, that's one of the things that needs to be understood is that, as people of color, one of the things that's happened is that we've had to learn everything about mainstream or white society and have to operate within that, as well as having our own set of rules within our own ethnicity or culture. So it's when he says that I'm not willing to come over and until you're willing to be as changed by my experience as I am with yours. That's really what he's saying, is to make sure that white people really work to understand the difference. So, and this lady is one of my favorites, Jane Elliott. I don't know why she's not more well known, but she's fabulous.
I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats our citizens, our black citizens. If you, as a white person, would be happy to receive the same treatment that our black citizens do in this society, please stand. You didn't understand the directions. If you white folks want to be treated the way blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
So understanding privilege, allyship, and white privilege. Privilege in and of itself is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. So for example, I have privileges of being a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And there are certain rights that I have, you know, as an employee tribal member there, as a tribal member, and those are my privileges. And that's something that anybody outside of the tribe does not get. Allyship, cooperating with one another. First, you need to understand privilege. Second, listen and do your homework. The internet is a huge place where you can find plenty of information. Number 3 is speak up and not over. So if you have the chance to clear the floor for a person of color to speak, I highly encourage you to do that. Number 4, know that you'll make mistakes, apologize, and commit to change and move forward. It happens to everybody. And number 5, ally is a verb. You can't just say it, you have to be it. So when we talk about white privilege, it's the social advantage white people have over other racial groups because of the color of their skin. Really nothing more than that. It has nothing to do with how you were raised or how you grew up, how hard you had to work for things. It's all in that concept of there are certain things going on in this society that benefit you by the color of your skin or disadvantage you based on your color of skin. So finally, when seeking justice, equity, and reconciliation, I really like this image because oftentimes within institutions, we're talking about giving everybody the same thing. And that's equality, you know, everybody gets the same thing. But the end result in this particular case is that, you know, he gets to see the game, this one gets to see the game, and this one doesn't. Now, when we're talking about equity, it's everybody getting what they need to succeed. So this guy, he didn't need that to be able to see over the fence. You know, what is the real goal here? The center one, he needed 1 box. And the last one, he needed 2 boxes in order to be able to watch the game. But now everybody has justice. So when we're talking about BIPOC only want what Caucasian people already have, it's not to take what whites have away. Rather, it's everybody sharing the benefits of the society the same as everyone else. So with that primer, I'm happy to go into being First Nations, Indigenous, Native American, and or American Indian, and specifically what was here before first contact. So what was there before? With the pre-colonial notions of traditional Indigenous worldview, you might have heard of the medicine wheel. And it provides the lesson and significance of 4 seasons, 4 cardinal directions, 4 sacred medicines. And then there's the medicine sphere, which provides the lessons and the significance of 7. There's the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, mental. There's also the cultural, the environmental, and then the centerpiece is the soul. For those of us who practice this traditional way, we believe that we are a soul having a human experience. So connection. Nature was the Aboriginal people's spiritual heritage. It defined their culture, their way of life, their fundamental rights, their religious and cultural ceremonies, their patterns of survival, and above all, their identity. Wesley and Smoluski. Aboriginal communities must have their land back in order to restore a healthy attachment with their caregiver. Furthermore, the land that needs to heal and will be healed through this reclamation. Some Native individuals believe that their pain is 400 years old. It's part of the land. Now understand that in the taking of the colonization of what we now call the United States, 1.25 million or billion acres was taken. Beyond the obvious manifestations of environmental destruction or earth wounding, Eduardo Duran says that soul wounding of the land can also occur when there's a massacre of human beings on the land. With the understanding of interconnectedness, when the earth is wounded, the people who are caretakers of the earth are also wounded at a very deep soul level. Values, attitudes, and beliefs that we hold. To cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. To know love is to know peace. To honor all of creation is to have respect. To face life with courage is to know bravery. To walk through this life with integrity is to know honesty. Humility is to know yourself as a sacred part of creation. And truth is to know all of these things. Now, so that's kind of what made me up. That's my orientation. This guy here was one of my professors, and he introduced me to a very famous man, Elie Wiesel, who is a survivor of Auschwitz, and also the creator of the International Peace Foundation. So I have to ask, what the heck happened in terms of historical trauma? We'll start from the bottom. Urban relocation policies, 1950 to 1970. Termination from 1954 to 1970, and that was where 5 different tribes in the United States of the 560 some that now exist actually lost their tribal status, and that's a constitutional issue because we have specific rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States as Native American people. The boarding schools ran from 1879 to 1973. Land cession was from 1492 on. Ongoing racism, 1492 on. Colonization, 1492 on. What did that create when we talk about the generations involved in this? Grief, loss, and trauma, and very little time during these periods to process all of that grief, loss, and trauma with wholly positive, healthy coping skills. So there was an overwhelm, a form of genocide that happened, or that's happening. So genocide defined. The Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the United Nations after World War II. Article 2 of the Convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. A, killing members of the group. For us as Native Americans, it happened institutionally 1492 to 1879 and socially enforced 1879 to present. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, 1492 to present. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, 1776 to present. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, beginning of the 1900s through the 1970s. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, institutionally was authorized between 1879 and 1964, and then socially implemented between 1965 and present. So if you have further questions about specific historical examples, please do get a hold of me. But I do want to talk a bit about boarding schools. So with that, this guy here on the porch on the top photo is actually Richard Pratt. And children were mandatorily required to go to residential Indian schools. The assimilation policy was passed in 1860. However, the first boarding school in the US was Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that opened in 1879. It closed in 1918, presumably because they needed the space for returning veterans and the influenza epidemic. Assimilation was the mission, and Pratt sold it to the government to kill the Indian and save the man. Children were shipped hundreds, if not thousands of miles from their home. You can see these before and after pictures of when they got off the trains and when they had been cleaned up by everybody. Here too, this individual when he came, and this individual once he was quote unquote cleaned up. You can see how little these children were and how their neurobiological disruption took place so early on. And this bottom one I wanted to keep in there because these are actually relatives of mine. The one on the left is a Garvin who originally was a black deer. He was forced to anglicize his name, and this picture was taken in 1907. He was shipped to Carlisle along with the two Lows here, the part of the Low family, and they had traveled almost 1,000 miles on train to get there. Now, boarding schools in the past were not the prep schools and elite conditions they are now. For us, it's many children tried to run away. Some succeeded, others died in the attempt. Many died from disease like tuberculosis, influenza, and other diseases from unsanitary conditions, like my aunt. Of those who died, many had unmarked graves, some with native names, others with newly picked English-sounding names. In any case, there was no accountability. Many children were abused physically, whips, cages, and manacles, as you can see up here. Look at how tiny those manacles are. But they would bring them back in those manacles as punishment for those who were runaways. Some babies born to students were sold to local families. In other cases, infanticide and pedicide was used to kill off babies and students that overflowed the schools. Punishment was harsh. Using native languages was punished. For example, there was a 4-year-old and she had 3 of her fingers cut off within the first 2 weeks of her attending a school. And children experienced corporal punishment for the first time. This was not our traditional way to use corporal punishment. It was more of a coaching and side-along approach where we would introduce a concept, work through with examples, then they would try it, and then they would master it. And that's pretty much the formula that was used for thousands of years. Now, boarding schools, on the other hand, assimilated at least 60,000 people, or 60,000 native children, with an approximated 6,000 dead. So some of the outcomes and dynamics to this, and these are all Wisconsin boarding schools, they learned to don't talk, don't feel, don't tell, don't trust. This is institution to institution. You wonder why we're still having trouble. Blame, shame, and guilt was learned. People who had gone to boarding school for any length of time were not easily accepted back home. They had lost out on a lot of learning during that time frame that they were gone. Speak English. Many were rendered mute from their first language due to harsh punishments. And in terms of speaking English, we turned that into a positive by really being able to communicate intertribally for the first time. People who attended boarding school were not parented, so they did not know how to parent. And it's really rough to still hear some of our elders tell how their parents could never say that I love you or give them a hug without making it feel like it was a secret. Over the years, these issues resulted in many first language native speakers dying without ever passing their native languages along to the next generations. Now, I talk about language. Why is that such a big concern? The language contains our stories, songs, poetry, values, and worldviews since time immemorial. Many believe that our language is given to us by the Creator and the words are sacred. So with the assimilation dynamics that took place, they include less primary source information and plenty of stereotype information. So think about throughout the 20th century, from 1900 to 1999, and you think about the number of people who were still, darker skin color, still spoke like the Ho-Chunk language, in my case, and as time went on, like as my dad died off, my grandparents died, my dad died, and then all of a sudden I didn't know the language, so I had less primary source information, and there was plenty of stereotype information, so that caused an identity concern for me, in the sense that who was I supposed to learn from now? Was I going to learn, from John Wayne Western movies, or the Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp? I mean, how much of an example is that for me? Efforts to increase tribal knowledge through tribal voices is a constant challenge for us, and we continue to invest quite a bit of our resources into those efforts. And through fewer non-native sources, constantly running against a generational time clock. So how do we fix this? So remember when I talked about community-based participatory research and practice-based evidence yielding to evidence-based practice? Well, we know that we serve our community. So what do? We hybridize. We know that we can't go back to the way things were pre-contact. That's ridiculous. So we evolve. We use aspects of our traditional healing. So Gabrielle Roth, I think, summed it up best in her quote. In many shamanic societies, if you came to a shaman or medicine person complaining of being disheartened, dispirited, or depressed, they would ask one of 4 questions. When did you stop dancing? When did you stop singing? When did you stop being enchanted by stories? And when did you stop finding comfort in the sweet territory of silence? Where we have stopped dancing, singing, and being enchanted by stories or finding comfort in silence is where we've experienced the loss of soul. And fourfold way also indicates something very similar. Dancing, singing, storytelling, and silence are the 4 universal healing salves. So we work to implement that. And as part of my resource background, I've also looked at what's called cradle to cradle. It was a concept developed by William McDonough and chemist Michael Braungart. With the hybridization, I mean, they have this whole concept, and he's an architect, Braungart's a chemist, but basically it comes down to if we make, build, manufacture, create anything, it either needs to be biodegradable or infinitely recyclable. If it's not, it shouldn't be made. With HIR Wellness Institute, we work these concepts along with the Children's Fire. So when we're talking about being a human services related area, we look at people, we're sharing knowledge, we accept the responsibility, and we expect high quality of life. So how do we achieve that? We achieve it through a positive, effective systems change in mental health by using these traditional healing practices along with what would be considered American medical or APA type practices as needed. But really, it comes down to the fact that the people are the medicine. Let me repeat that. People are the medicine. And that's the term that Leah coined. It's called community activated medicine. So what she does is she has us work with mental health. And as we do systems outreach, like I am today, systems and community hopefully are positively affected. And so in turn, fewer people are coming to us with mental health concerns and rather more community activated medicine pieces, which are good for us all. That's the wellness in this. So like our workplace culture, we use medicine. We also have the concepts of giving and reciprocity as a very basic part of what we do. And of course, we're using community values. For our sexual assault advocates, I'm the head of our advocacy group. Teresa Stevens is pretty dang special. She's a lady that we managed to get through a University of Wisconsin Milwaukee grant. And as our sexual assault advocate, she's really the person that will go and do, you know, the hardcore rescues to some of the more longitudinal situations like domestic violence. Regardless, I call my team community healers. We use community activated medicine, understanding that people are the medicine by encouraging relationships and using our cultural teachings and ways. And it's the understanding that sometimes strength and resilience on our healing journey means that we need to lean into others and take a moment of respite and reflection. It's okay to be supported. This is done not only by embracing the collective power of the community, but also by honoring the diversity of our relatives, which is what we call our clients, and their needs, and recognizing that each person has the right to choose their own path of wellness, self-care, and mental health. CARE stands for Community Advocate Resource Emotional Support. So what is advocacy? To me, it's the ability for one person to hold space for another who's having a rough time. It might mean the advocate is holding someone's hand, assisting with remembering medical instructions, possibly calling and making appointments for that person. It depends on what that person needs and who are in advocacy. And we who are in advocacy provide what assistance we can with compassion, love, and dedication to the person who's been hurt. For us within HIR Wellness, we believe that once a person's been victimized or hurt, it shouldn't cost them to heal. So we actually don't collect insurance cards. We don't do any of that. We work solely on VOCA funds. So we also have practices that are culturally resilient, hybridized with the neurobiologically informed practices. We put together a healing kit, and that provides immediate stress reduction strategies. It supports co-regulation, offers culturally respectful teachings, and includes sacred medicines. So there's a small abalone shell in there with some medicines for smudge. And then there's healing informed coping tools, which include a rock to hold on to ground ourselves and to be able to meditate. Culturally responsive materials that include instructions and directions so that people who haven't had the cultural access in the past don't have to worry about the protocols in order to get there. We're happy to help. And then victims' rights and support resources as well. It's amazing that it all fits in there. The healing kit and associated support services through our organization is provided free and cost to victims of crime. Now, pre-COVID, we operated obviously a lot differently. And this was our Red Sands event number 3, sorry, didn't correct the slide last night. But we did a social justice walk where people could learn about the historical trauma that I just talked about. We also had a giveaway of skirts. The red skirt with the ribbons has become a trend of activism among people to raise awareness regarding missing and murdered Indigenous people. And one of the things that we do with our Red Sands event is to actually pour red sand. And it was an artist in Texas who started this, and literally the sand that she collects is red from a Texas beach. And she sends these out across the country so that when we actually pour the red sand, it fills in the cracks. And it's a huge message to all of us to know that the people who are members of the missing and murdered Indigenous people have fallen through the cracks of our services. So we offer that remembrance and acknowledgement of that time. So I talked about Teresa. One of the cool things that she's done is actually put together some rescue kits as well. And with those, she handmade the bags. She's got different things in different sizes. She's gotten this all in donation old powwow t-shirts, healing kit, some of the different things that they'll need, like possibly if it's like a sexual assault response to a hospital, then we have like a manicure kit, because not all the SANES are giving you something when they collect the evidence for your fingernails. You know, so it's little things like that, but very intentional to really bring that personal touch to people. And of course, you know, with COVID law, everything's new. So it's really an impressive thing. So with COVID, one of the things that we needed to do was provide our services online. And Leah, amazingly, along with the team, managed to get this turned around in like a week and a half, where we were offering all of a sudden Facebook Lives and Zoom meetings. And this fall, it includes sensory fitness, emotional sobriety, children's fire book club, trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, resilience and reflections, elders book club, which is a lot of fun, survivors of suicide, daughters of tradition, and Zentangle. So all of these pieces we offer online, and that's probably the greatest disparity, is if a person doesn't have access. But you know, whether it's within the city of Milwaukee or the area, or within the state of Wisconsin, you can feel free to register for these services. For example, these are the types of meditations that we use for our daily R&R with Malia, Monday through Friday, and emotional sobriety with Jamie, which is once a week, and then Elder Book Club with Malia and Xavier. So like the meditation we can contemplate is when you get older and you're ready, your ancestors will show up to guide you. And the Creator helped me to become ready and teachable. So some good thoughts to muster up those good feelings. We invite you to come to our 4th annual CAM and Red Sands event, Community Activated Medicine. By the end of today, our Eventbrite should be up and running. So you'll be able to pre-register, grab a device, join us, and then explore the different booths that we have that are relevant to Red Sands, missing and murdered Indigenous people, and the resources with regards to sexual assault, general advocacy, occupational therapy, and counseling. So I primarily used HIR Wellness and Rise Center today as the sources. And this is what these organizations have in common that I find are really significant. They both seek justice and equity. It's really important for the people that we serve to feel that they are being treated with justice and equitably. The leadership includes people in the decisions. So if that's not something that your organization does, maybe it's something you should consider. Rise is youth-based, and they have a youth council. For HIR Wellness, we're community-based, and we have the Children's Fire, which is at least 16 people who contemplate and discuss a question from the different perspectives. And then our elders make the decision to advise the CEO on what we're going to do next. We work to create safety, physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, culturally, and environmentally. We make and maintain relationships with resources, partnerships all over, a resistance to injustice. So we actively partner with other organizations like Sojourner and so on with pieces like, or I should say issues and social justice action like Black Lives Matter. We're responsive and we're conducting research. We also include the creativity and fun, not only to help us as the employees balance, but very much to help generate the community activated medicine where people want to have fun with culture, be able to create and be able to feel supported. So this goes back to you as an employee as well. And so I put this slide in here generally as self-care to understand vicarious trauma. Within, I think, the email, we're going to send to you, there's different handouts, and one of them is a self-care plan and with the medicine wheel. And then the other one is a self-care word search. So just some suggestions, a little bit of fun. Also within that packet, there's a worksheet for you to work on. It's called Your Turn, Our Healing Forest. Look at your community through the medicine sphere. What could be better about it? What do we have to do to make it better? To reinforce all of your efforts, how are you implementing prevention so the good stuff stays in place? What kinds of interventions or techniques help with peers, colleagues, and clients? And what is needed to bridge these solutions together? And these are the types of questions that we look at constantly with HIR Wellness. So it's a very actively thinking and responsive organization. So I started off by saying, I want to inspire people and I want someone to look at me and say, because of you, I didn't give up. So with the training today, my hope is that I gave you some of the tools so that should you encounter somebody that's in need of our type of medicine, they will say to you, because of you, I didn't give up. So remember, one of the big parts of this is vulnerability. Vulnerability is being willing to express the truth no matter what, the truth of who you are, the essence at your core of what you're feeling at any given moment. It's being able to open up your soul so that others can see their soul in yours, by Oprah. So there's the sources and questions.
Thank you so much, Barb. That was incredible. If folks want to take a moment to think of questions, we did have one come up during the presentation. And Susan would like to ask, do you have any experience with or information on healing intergenerational trauma via brain spotting practice by Dr. Frey? Wasn't sure. It sounds like they were curious if you had any experience with that.
Our staff members have actually started the first part of training on that, but we haven't finalized that. I mean, there's like 2 specific parts, and they've gone through the experience themselves, but they have not gone through this next part yet to actually certify them. It's a fascinating process, and I personally have just started to look at the possibilities. But from what I've heard from my colleagues, it was a mind-blowing experience and really impressive in terms of being able to kind of use the effects of EMDR, like the tracking where your eye movement goes, but then being able to use that as an in-depth way into the body. And the body, of course, is what's recording the pain. And then it fascinatingly will release that through the brain spotting process. So yeah, I would love to learn more about it, but haven't used it in practice yet.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much. We did have another question come in. Someone asking, what is the best way to inquire as an advocate about how to support or assist someone of a different community or culture in locating a resource that is culturally based? You
can always call HIR Wellness. And, you know, we have the bilingual support. We work with Indigenous. And then, of course, we have partners within the Latinx community, Hmong, and Black communities throughout Milwaukee. And then we're starting to get networked into the state.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have another question for you, Barb. Okay. So Jessica wants to know, do you have a suggestion or plural suggestions of ways to introduce people to the notion of generational trauma or historical trauma, as in people who likely live with these impacts but have maybe not considered the weight that they carry?
I think that, well, what I'm doing here today is one of the things that I can do for community presentations. My prior position before COVID was with my tribe, and one of the things that I did was to create community awareness with regards to historical trauma, because it's really, I think it impacts 100% of us. You know, so that historical and intergenerational transmission are all pieces that we have to consider. We see it within, you know, family lines, whether there's, you know, incest or sexual assault going on, or, you know, so there's the power differential issues, the oppression issues. And I guess that's why I spent a little bit more time on the boarding schools, because that's really where a lot of that was introduced. Not that it wasn't there before, but certainly it was highlighted and emphasized during those years. And between 1879 and 1970, the United States had these schools running. And so that's certainly within my lifetime. And in Canada, should you encounter that, since we're up north here, theirs didn't stop until 1996. So yeah, I think that just approaching a person to talk about, you know, their family history, and if that's too uncomfortable in terms of the trauma, then perhaps talking generally about understanding the cultural aspects of historical trauma, I think, are good places to start the conversation.
Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I can definitely speak for everybody who's attended, and I know so because we've seen it in the comments. Folks absolutely are so grateful to you and what you shared today. This was an incredible presentation, Barb. A lot of folks saying so. And a question that I'd love to put to the group, if people want to share in chat or just sit with this themselves, is to think about what stood out to you about today's presentation, maybe what feelings were brought up for you, and thinking about how we apply the wonderful resources and insight that Barb has shared to our work as preventionists, and being cognizant of the trauma that the communities we're serving might have experienced and how that does come into play when we are serving survivors or trying to go further upstream and prevent violence from happening in the first place. So if anybody wants to share in the chat or raise their hand or have other questions and thoughts, we're happy to sit tight and attend to those as well.
Yeah, I'm so used to being face to face that this is just such a different experience.
I mean, this is also my first time on this webinar format. I'm sure that many of us are really used to the meeting style, especially these days with COVID.
Yeah. Well, I'm just so pleased that everybody could make it today, and dedicated the time and the courage it takes to go through this work. You do it every day, and I am so grateful to you on behalf of humanity, on behalf of everybody that I see and experience. So in that sense, thank you so much for all of your work. As an assault survivor and a women-led organization, HIR Wellness is up and coming, and I think that we have some good things to contribute, and I'm hoping that people will take advantage of our services.
Absolutely. One participant just shared, people as medicine really impacted them and always will, and it was a powerful reminder. Connection heals is what they shared. Another participant said, thank you so much for the focus on our earth protectors. And lots of folks saying that they want to share this information with others and pass this information along because it was so impactful for them.
Good. Excellent. Yeah, with the people or the medicine, one of the conversations that Leah and I had early on, and I've been on this journey with her for 5 years now, was that she mentioned, like, within the mental health field, because she's a therapist, and she had talked about how oftentimes, if you go into a therapist within 20 minutes or so, they have a requirement to make a diagnosis of some kind, even if it's the general assessment or whatever they're documenting, so that they can code it for insurance. And that, I think, pathologizes us in ways that, we're not crazy. I mean, not to say that that's a very PC way to put anything, but when you're thinking about that in your own terms for your own self and going, how did I just get diagnosed with this thing? And what does it mean? Where am I going with this? How am I supposed to heal? And then to think that it's all because of money, that's really a very hard comment about our institutions and how we go about treating people. So in that sense, it made me think a lot. Another thing that she's mentioned that we're kind of contemplating is actually writing up the pathology for white supremacy, because oftentimes it's people of color that are getting these diagnoses, and it's not necessary. So I find that a very interesting possibility over the next decade or so. We'll see if it goes into the DSM.
Right, see how that comes along. We did have somebody share, just reflect out a very relevant and timely thought of how in their PhD program, there was research among the similarities between Native women, Black women in terms of their experience with sexual abuse in gynecological experimentation and the loss of their children, which feels they shared very present when we think about what folks at the border are experiencing today. Latinx children still being held in cages, separated from their families and their culture. So much of what you shared, oftentimes in mainstream education, gets coded as historical, and therefore it's not something we have to worry about. But as your presentation showed, we know that the impacts are still very real today.
Well, and at all times, we are all making history, you know, so it's very much alive and changing. You know, and with the children in the cages at the border, you know, the borders were crossed us. They didn't, you know, these are our people. They're your people too. And it's so painful to continue to watch this happen because it is a modern form of genocide and completely unnecessary.
I would hope that the research on how white supremacy is affecting folks of color will be added into future DSMs. As the ACEs research is fairly new when we think about when that came out and how that trauma pyramid has evolved to include more the impacts of historical trauma, and how that is like the base of our existence as human beings. So I would hope that that would be included, and especially since more public health departments are recognizing racism as a public health issue, I think there's a lot of movement towards that, and I hope that that momentum continues.
I hope so too. I want to believe that the country that I live in is humane and working toward the better. And I just don't feel like that right now. So everybody vote.
Thing that always strikes me when we talk about ACEs that stuck out to me again today is thinking about like how many traumatic experiences aren't captured in that list. And I know that they can't put everything on the list, but just thinking about there's this whole world of trauma outside of even what we're thinking about when we're talking about ACEs. And I don't know that I really have a question with that. I just kind of want to mention it.
Well, and that's, I think, you know, when I said this is your money slide, you know, you've got the ACEs experience, but then you also have that historical trauma experience. So you've got two dynamics running there. You know, for my dad with PTSD, he had that from World War II. You know, he was just learned that he's a code talker, which means that he had a person within his branch of service that was supposed to kill him in order to save the code. I mean, talk about friendly fire and weird circumstances in the military. That's part of being a code talker at that time. You know, so he had those traumas, you know, with burial detail in the Philippines and all of those different things. But then he also had these elements of the historical trauma in his lifetime that, you know, he probably didn't look too closely at, but just said, you know, this is the way things are, and moving on forward. Not unlike a lot of our relatives or clients who come in and basically say, well, this is my life, and, you know, what can I make of it? You know, when they're searching for help, you know, where do you start that conversation and how far do you go? And that's where community activated medicine helps a lot. You know, some of our events are incredibly fun. You know, we get the hard stuff in the morning and that kind of thing, but, you know, by midday, we're smiling and laughing and doing good things together to create a sense of community and support for one another. And that lasts. It's a lasting medicine that helps so much with that social connection in particular.
I think it's especially important to try and find those social connections even now, considering the world that we're living in now, and who knows for any foreseeable future what that might look like and how. I mean, our lives will probably be changed in some way forever by all of this. I really appreciated your discussion around resiliency, because I think we need to have that conversation when we talk about trauma, and how we are resilient people, and we all have these abilities. So it's important to remember that when we have those discussions of trauma, how we are resilient people.
Yes. And after going through some trainings where, wow, they were really depressing, I learned that I had to add in the resilience factors right away as a more responsible way to go about focusing good energy toward the problems that whatever the training brought up for me had to be managed, so that was the way I did that, was to add in, instead of just saying, well, here's your ACEs score and now let's talk about trauma and loss and grief and death and this and that, no, we got to add in some of the good stuff too.
It's sometimes hard to remember that a lot of people in the chat spoke out about that resiliency checklist that you put into your PowerPoint. A lot of people were really appreciative of that, because it's so easy when we are experiencing trauma and the after effects of that trauma to forget a lot of that stuff. I think when it's so easy to remember all of the bad things, or even when someone's like giving you compliments, like it's easy to forget the compliments, but then when someone tells you something like constructive criticism or constructive feedback, those are the narrowly focused things that we tend to focus on. We don't remember all of those resilient factors about ourselves, the joy that we have that within ourselves and around us. Mm-hmm. So adapting to the world that we're living in and trying to remember that there are people around us, that we have that protectiveness. We just need to reach out to it. Like you mentioned, that support system. You were mentioning the support system over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Pandemic time.
Yeah. I have a question, Barbara, about resiliency. My own question. How that the score was based on a lot of your maybe childhood. So I was curious to hear what you said about how does resiliency change over time? Like your perception of, at one point in life you might say, yeah, I have this great support system. My mom and dad loved me, my grandparents, but like the perception of that might change over time as you go through trauma. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious what more you would have to say about that change over time.
For me, that's kind of a life cycle thing, because at some point your parents will pass, and if life goes the way it's supposed to, where parents pass before the children, then you'll have other things that come in to not necessarily replace, but bolster, because you remember the relationship you had with, your mom or dad and how special that was. And then perhaps that special level of support and resilience now comes from your children, or your pets or whatever. Because, it's a balance. It's always a balance. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons of the medicine wheel and the medicine sphere, is that it's about balance. And I think that when you look at the negative energy that's out there, you got to bolster it with the positive. If there's hate, we have to have hope and love. And that's just kind of, I think, the way life balances itself.
Thank you. We had a follow-up question to that, Barb. Why do you think there isn't a lot of attention given to the importance of resiliency, especially in schools where youth are being served every day?
That is a great question and a very complex one. Mental health, a social curriculum, however you want to put it, has been, put to the back burner, I think, a lot because, well, one, we're in a virtual land now, but then also we had testing, hardcore testing, and talk about evidence-based practice, and that's constantly a a challenge within schools is to keep their funding. And so they do the testing and so they can get their funding, you know, and it becomes this vicious cycle. Well, in doing so, they've lost a lot of the life lessons that when, you know, you had a one-room schoolhouse or whatever, and they had conversations about what was moral and what was right and ethical and those types of things and how to get along with people. Those are all lessons that I think we've lost in a lot of ways and aren't taught in schools, and that we hope the parents will teach at home. And that doesn't necessarily happen. But at the same time, whose responsibility is that? And I have to say that it's not the parents, it's not the schools solely. It's everybody, and that includes the community. You know, when I see kids that misbehave in front of my house, I'm calling them out, you know. You know, and other parents have yelled at me for that, and then I'll have a conversation with them too. But, you know, it's just, I guess, the kind of person that I was raised to be and that I want to be within my neighborhood. I want to be involved. I want to be connected. I want to be respected. And I want, you know, a good life.
Had a total snapping moment when you're talking about schools not focusing on actual life lessons, feeling that it's more, it's all a numbers game. It's all numbers and quantity instead of quality, and really trying to teach our young people the skills to survive in this ever-changing world. And it's not focused on that anymore. So yeah, total like snapping moment when you were talking about that, because that is absolutely true. I remember elementary school feeling like a sense of community in elementary school, and especially middle school more so than elementary school, and how that even lost going into high school because it's a bigger environment. Yeah, it's just not that much of a focus anymore.
Oh, I have so many thoughts on that. It's just, yeah, it's an interesting conversation because I so want to be able to take the schools and shake them up and say this is how they ought to be run. But at the same time, you know, we have to look at assessment. Our districts are local control. There are opportunities to actually sit down with school boards and say, you know, where's our social curriculum, you know, and how is that defined? What lessons are you teaching? And if it's character counts or good neighbors or whatever the curriculum is, then, you know, how is it getting implemented in the classroom every day, every month, every year? And unfortunately, like I said, those lessons have gone to the background because they aren't core standards. They're not fundable. And yet the cost to our community is incredible. You know, so I think the school board has to balance off their assessments for funding and also take a look at how they're serving their communities by saying, okay, you know, what's our rate of crime around here? How many people are below the poverty line and not doing well? How many people need housing? You know, and those types of indicators, I think, too, are pieces that school districts can have a huge part in assisting. You know, but that's me and my happy little Barb world. So.
It's a very good point, getting to those root causes of trauma, root causes of violence, and fixing them.
Mm-hmm.
As simple as that, right? Fixing those, if only it were that simple.
Exactly.
Just fix it. It'll be fine.
Slap a Band-Aid on it. Rub some dirt in it.
Well, I know. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
No, go ahead, because you actually had a question. I was going to say that I'm so happy to be here today.
We were so thrilled and excited to have you, Barb, and thank you so much from from all of us at WCASA and for everybody who attended. I know that we're just about at time. We have a few minutes, so if folks have any last minute questions, please feel free to submit them. But thank you so very much for everybody who attended and watched and learned from Barbara today. And thank you, Barb, for sharing your time and your wisdom and your resources with us. If anybody needs to get in touch with WCASA, please feel free to email any one of our prevention teams and the folks who are working on the series here, Angie, Megan, Peter, or myself. Barbara has shared her information, I know, with HIR Wellness if you need to get in touch with her. And if you have any follow-up questions, do feel free to reach out and we'll do what we can to help you.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for your attention and for being with me on this webinar. And it's so different. It's so crazy. I'm used to seeing people, you know, face to face. But yeah, I mean, it's a passion for me in human services, and that's not going to change. And obviously I have a symbiotic relationship with the human services field and trying to heal myself while I help to hopefully facilitate healing in others. So, you know, it's a real privilege and I'm humbled to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I hope people learn something. I hope they think about stuff. And if you have questions, yeah, feel free to get in touch. And if you don't have my info, we can certainly get it through WCASA.
Folks are singing your praises, Barbara. People loved it. Knocked it out of the park.
They've been singing praises the entire time. It's
the entire time, like from the jump. People are like, this is incredible. This is amazing.
Well, I look forward to reading the comments, so I'll just be really interested to see what that says.
So maybe should we share the slide about your contact information again, Barbara?
Sure.
If that's easy for you, because I know there was a comment or a question, and then we can share the schedule for the upcoming webinars too.
Cool.
So what I have found in my life on Zoom is that if I want information, I just take a picture of it with my phone and then go back to it later on.
Yep. That's exactly what I do.
Because there's so much information right on this slide. That's what I have found has been super helpful. I even snapped a couple of pictures from your slides. They were really good.
Well, thank you. And if you're interested in the programming, like I have Jamie's information there on the left side. Jamie Kellycutt is our fabulous communications outreach person. And so she oftentimes gets the registration responsibilities. And so if you're interested in either participating or just seeing our programming, just experiencing it a time or two to see what we're doing, feel free to contact her. You can also tune into our Facebook Live posts every morning at 8 o'clock, Monday through Friday with R&R with Malia. You know, so we have a pretty decent schedule going. If you're interested in seeing more of that programming or getting involved in the deeper stuff, then we do have more privacy with our Zoom rooms. And those particular areas are more for, you know, our children's protection and like our sobriety piece and those types of things. They're more, we try to create virtual safe spaces so that people can feel comfortable getting what they need. So. Okay, so I'll do a stop share and you can put the WCASA stuff back up, right?
Yep, here we go.
All right.
And we'll also send a copy of this flyer out with the recording and the resources too.
Awesome.
Yes, so next session will be October 23rd, so that's 2 weeks from now. And we will be joined by the authors of Sexual Citizens, and we'll be chatting about the dynamics of sexual assault in campus communities. So please join us for that if you can.
And don't forget the giveaway. You're already included in the giveaway.
We have copies of the book, yes.
So at the end of the session, we will be selecting a couple of winners and sending out the book. It's a really incredible book.
Yeah, I've just started it and it's really great.
It's such a good read. And that's coming from somebody who typically only reads fiction.
Same, big same.
Well, again, Barbara, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. I really want to watch that, the videos that you showed. I really want to watch the full thing. The Color of Fear, that was what that was called, right?
Yes.
That was fantastic. I really want to see that full film.
And there's a follow-up to it as well. I mean, in 1994, you would think, oh, this is outdated information, and yet we still see it within our society today. And it's, you know, just seeming louder and prouder lately, frighteningly so. So yeah, Color of Fear is great, and then Color of Fear 2. And then there's also several pieces on YouTube by Lee Manois, where he does like a TED Talk, and I think Victor Lewis also does some work, as does Mr. Chavez. So there's some great stuff on YouTube.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we are actually a little over time even. I lost track there. So thanks so much to Barb. Thanks so much to everyone else for attending today and for the work that you all do every day. Angie, Sarah, Peter, anything to add?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everybody. We'll
Have
see
a good
you.
weekend, everyone.
Yes.